Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Malcolm Maestrel and I'm a Membership Services Coordinator with IAAP. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Ableism and Digital Accessibility, a French Citizen's Point of View. Before we begin, we have a few general housekeeping items to go over. Closed captioning is provided. To enable closed captioning, select the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The stream text links for English, French, German, Spanish, and Swedish will be posted in the chat as well. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Susanna for her wonderful job with the translations.
Thank you, Malcolm. Sie können das auf Deutsch lesen, wenn Sie dem im Chat angegebenen Link folgen. Puedes leer el español si sigues el enlace provisto en el chat. Du kan läsa texten på svenska om du klickar på länken som vi lägger i chatten. And today we have a French native speaker who can do the French part of this so that I don't feel embarrassed. Please, Harmonie.
Pour avoir la traduction en français, la traduction automatique des sous-titres, vous trouverez le lien dans le chat.
Thank you.
Today, we are also running a test of Zoom's new sign language interpretation feature, and we would greatly appreciate any feedback. We will be posting a quick survey for feedback at the end of the webinar. This includes international and American Sign Language interpretation. To view the American Sign Language interpreter, select the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Microphones are muted to prevent any background noise or disruptions. Please post your questions in the Q&A. Questions will be saved until the end of the presentation. The chat will be monitored for general dialogue and technical issues. Today's webinar will be recorded and available in our webinar archives, and we will send out a copy of the recording to everyone who registered. And now I'd like to turn today's program over to our moderator, Susanna Lauren.
Thank you, Malcolm, again, and we will stick to English this time. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is the third webinar we are doing this season after having the big event on the 23rd of September, where we celebrated the anniversary of the Web Accessibility Directive. And we are looking forward to more webinars next year. So my name is Susanna Lauren. I'm the IAAP representative to the EU, which means that I try to lead the kind of umbrella initiative supporting members in all EU countries, and of course also supporting the chapters we have on European soil. And when we talk about IAAP EU or the European part of IAAP, then we of course always mean the EU proper, but also what we call family and friends. So we cover not only the EU member states, but also Switzerland, Norway, Iceland. Just recently we got our first member in Iceland, and also the UK, of course. So it's a bit, we are not that kind of picky about exactly where the borders are, but the idea is to really support everyone who is either living in the EU or working in the EU or have clients working in the EU, so that we can make sure that you get the best possible support when it comes to EU legislation and policies and so on. And I'll get back after today's webinar with a little bit of forward-looking information about what is happening after this webinar and so on. But today I would like to welcome Armony Altinier, who is the founder and CEO of Koena in France, and she has promised to speak in English to us today, which we are very happy for, of course. And France is a very interesting country, not only because it's my favorite place on earth and has the best food and wine and so on, but also from an accessibility perspective. I think France is a little bit maybe challenging these days. So I'm very happy that we get really the inside information about France from one of the people who really knows accessibility from that part of the globe, very has a strong commitment and has been working in the field for many years. So please, Armony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susanna. So I can't share my screen. Thanks. Okay, so I'll do my best to speak in English, and I hope everyone is going to understand. So the context of this presentation is the discussion between Susan and I, and as you introduced it, it seems a little foggy, maybe, when you're outside, and the question was, what's going on in France? So we had only 2 countries out of 27 didn't report to the European Commission how they implemented the Web Accessibility Directive in December 2021, France and Cyprus, and we still haven't reported yet. And I will give some insight on maybe why. But I want to give a point of view as a French citizen. I don't represent French people, so it will be my own opinion. I will add some links in the presentation, so maybe you can download it later. So you can have some sources, but I will also give my opinion on that. So my name is Armony Altinier. I am a citizen of the world, but born in France. I'm disabled myself. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. That's why I do web accessibility. So I studied Chinese. I have a master's degree in Chinese and in political science. And when I wasn't able to use a mouse, I had to use the keyboard, and I discovered sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. And that's why I fall in digital accessibility. I started a career in digital accessibility as a consultant and trainer since 2007. I wrote with others the French digital accessibility guidelines based on the WCAG in the version 3 for the French state. And I wrote a book too, and I founded Koena in 2016. So that's for the background. The question today is, how can a country like France, that is legally and technically advanced compared to other countries, be so far behind in the implementation of the Web Accessibility Directive? I will try to address this question in 2 times. We'll have an overview of the legal and technical framework that exists in France since 2005, so far before the Web Accessibility Directive. And I'll give some, in the second part, thoughts about why it doesn't work to me. And in a part I called implementation biased by cultural lag. So let's dive into the first part and have an overview of the legal and technical framework in France. Before the Web Accessibility Directive, we were quite early, actually. We have the French disability law since February 2005. We had, because having a law is really not enough, but we had a decree in 2009, and everything is supposed to be accessible in France since 2012 in the public sector. So it was really early. We signed the CRPD, the Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in 2007, and made a ratification in 2010. So it was really early. The disability law is called the Law for Equal Rights and Opportunities, Participation and Citizenship of People with Disability. And back in 2005, we already had an Article 47 dedicated to digital accessibility. Actually, we already had everything in 2005. And it was only for the public sector, but it's the case with the Web Accessibility Directive. And I told you everything is supposed to be accessible since 2012, and yet 4% of websites, the public sector, had an accessibility statement in 2014. So they started something. It's a study from Rynet. And it's maybe, I don't know if it's worse, but it's not really better today. Between the Web Accessibility Directive and the French law, we had a new law in 2016, 10 days before the Web Accessibility Directive, a law for a digital republic. And this law aimed to extend the application of the Web Accessibility Law to the private sector, big companies, but it never entered into force because of the Web Accessibility Directive. So it was really strange because we knew we were going to have a European directive, but at the same time, we have a new law that just disappeared. But that's what explain the difference we have in the implementation of the Web Accessibility Directive. The Web Accessibility Directive has been adopted in October 2016, and we made an update of the Article 47 of the disability law in France. So the law was voted in September 2018, the decree came in 2019, and the ministerial ruling, that's really the last part, which make it really applicable, came in September 2019. And in this transposition, we changed something that is quite technical, but really important. We changed the approach. So before the Web Accessibility Directive, the technical guidelines, which are RGAA, so Référentiel Général d'Amélioration de l'Accessibilité, were a transposition of the WCAG. So the aim of the technical rules were to check if we're compliant with the WCAG. I know it's something maybe strange for you because some of you use directly WCAG, but I will explain in the second part why we have this specificity. But after the Web Accessibility Directive, RGAA became a transposition of the Web Accessibility Directive requirements. So by implementing the Web Accessibility Directive, the governments already had new legal exemptions that we didn't have before and decrease the obligations for France because we already had obligations with the Article 47, but we didn't have all these exemptions, for example, for live captioning. Now you have an exemption and before you didn't have. So it didn't improve the accessibility requirement in France. They used the Web Accessibility Directive to lower the requirements. But thanks to the law of 2016, they kept the requirements for the private sector. So we have technical requirements that are less that lowers, but we have more organizations that are now concerned by the digital accessibility law. And even if we have almost everything, we still are waiting for a ministerial ruling, which is not nothing. This Article 6 of the decree says the accessibility statement is communicated to the administration by means of a teleservice. according to the terms and conditions determined jointly by the Minister in charge of people with disability and the Minister in charge of digital technology. So it was in 2019, we're in 2022, and we still don't have any means to give the administration communicate the accessibility statements. So maybe that's a clue to explain why we don't have a report, because we don't have any means to collect these accessibility statements, even if it was in the decree. And you could ask, what about the European Accessibility Act? We're still waiting, of course. I hope, so we're late. The deadline was June this year, but we're still waiting. So I hope at the beginning of 2023, maybe, I can tell you more. So we saw we had already a legislation that exists since 2005. And even if it was not perfect, it was there. And we already had technical guidelines in French and people who were trained to apply those guidelines. And this is thanks to a strong community in France. So from AccessiWeb to RGAA, we have a strong community. BrainNet is an association, BrainNet, which had a major role to develop digital accessibility, web accessibility in France, and to develop skills and a real community. They created a project in, I think it was in 2003, that was called AccessiWeb. AccessiWeb was guidelines that was based on the WCAG since 2003. And we also had, they also had an independent label. So that was the first French web accessibility guidelines, AccessiWeb. And we had maybe more than 500 persons trained to use this AccessiWeb guidelines. So there were training, there are certification, and we had different approach of the WCAG. All criteria were, and it's still the case, were written as a question. If you answer yes, it's passed. If you answer no, it's failed. So that's maybe something you think is not really important, but it is. And you have more criteria in the RGAA, in the AccessiWeb, sorry, than in the WCAG, because when you have, for example, the success criteria 1.1.1, you have so many cases of exemption. For each one, you have a different criteria in the AccessiWeb guidelines. So it's, I think, easier to use, but not as robust as the WCAG. In 2009, we had the first decree of the accessibility law. And for one country, France, we have two standards because the French government decided to publish a bit instead of using what AccessiWeb and the community did. They created a new standard out of nowhere. So we had a lot of people who were trained using AccessiWeb, and you had a new standard, which was not WCAG, but something else. And what AccessiWeb did, it was a correspondence between AccessiWeb and RGAA. So we have a lot of standards and no implementation. So it was a bit confusing for users. And in 2015, so years later, AccessiWeb became RGAA version 3. So now we have only RGAA, and we have a lot of people who are trained to use these guidelines. The version 3 introduced WAY ARIA and a new national label, the label e-accessible RGAA. In 2019, the impact of the Web Accessibility Directive RGAA was the introduction of new legal exemption, the introduction of the derogation for a disproportionate burden, and that's really a problem because we have really big abuse of that. And what was good with this Web Accessibility Directive is the subject was back on the agenda. There was a reactivation of the interest in the subject. And there were formally identified a control body, even if we had the name of the body, but nobody behind actually control anything. And to finish this story about the community, because AccessiWeb, that was maybe the main project of the Association BrailleNet, became something legal because it became the RGAA. So BrailleNet just didn't find another purpose, and they closed the door. And in June this year, so it's definitely the end of an era. And now we don't really have a space for the community. So we still are a community, a lot of people, some work in the private companies, some in the administration, we know each other, but we don't have a space now to really communicate on a neutral field. So when we see this story since 2005, we can see we have everything that should make France as a champion of digital accessibility. We have skills, we have the law, we have technical guidelines that are operable, but from theory to practice, there's a big step. And I like this quotation of Robert Badinter, who was a minister in France and the leader of the abolition of death penalty. And he said a few years ago that France, we often say it's the country of human rights. So we say when France boasts of being the country of human rights, it's a figure of speech. It's the country of the Declaration of Human Rights. To go further is a matter of historical blindness. So this transition is to lighten that the problem of digital accessibility is not only because of accessibility. We have the same problem, for example, for sustainability and other matters. And I think, so the first part is more founded on facts, and I will give you all the sources if you want to check the history. But the second part is more, I have some facts, but it's also my opinion. I think because we're working with Koena, I created Koena actually to open the research in France at a European level, and we work in several European projects with partners in Spain, in Cyprus. We're not the best, but with Greece and the UK and several countries, Austria. And that's really interesting to see that what's happening in France is not a fatality. It's really something that has a cultural base. The first problem, maybe, is that we do not have a pilot in the plane. We don't know who is in charge because nobody is in charge, nobody is responsible. First, when we come to the implementation of the directive, something important is to understand that we have two approaches. We have the governmental approach, the executive approach, and we have the civil society represented by two bodies, the National Advisory Council on Disability, in French is the acronym CNCPH, and the National Digital Council. And the government must consult them, but they can do what they want. So they consult them. Both said the decree was a bad one, but they published it anyway. So we already have a problem of democracy. And we have a report, actually. You didn't know, but I can tell you. We have a report which said we have 40% on the web of the French public sector that is accessible according to the Defender of Rights. It was published in February 2022. But this report is contested, sorry. And in response, the National Advisory Council on Disability published an article in the month before, just a few weeks before, entitled Public Web and Accessibility Making Good Use of Numbers. They consider the WebM study, you know, the 1 million reports, is closer to the French reality with a rate of about 3%. So from 40% to 3%. And why do we have such a difference? It's because of the methodology they decided to use. So we have something we call l'Observatoire de la qualité des démarches en ligne. So it's an observatory of the state's online procedures. Actually, it's about the 250 most useful procedures present in France, but at the national level only. And what you must understand is we have some services that are not in a national level, but that are really important. For example, if you want to make your child to go to lunch at school, to have lunch at school, you need to use procedures that are in a town level, not a national one. So they are not part of the calculation. And if you have, it depends, for the transportation, it's the regional level, it's not the state. So this observatory is ready only for the national one, but it's a start. And they have only two criteria to say if it's accessible or not in this observatory. The first one is the presence of a valid accessibility statement that is less than 3 years old. And the second one is the compliance rate of more than 75% achieved in the accessibility statement. So why not? But we had a big, not conflict, but a big discussion in France on how we should calculate. And we don't use the same score, everyone. So it's supposed to be in the accessibility statement, we should use the global score, but to improve the rate, a lot of administration in the observatory use the average score. I'm not sure if it's clear or not for everyone, these two different kind of calculation. So for example, if you have a sample of 10 pages, and all criteria are applicable. And if one page is 0% pass criteria, but the 9 other pages or views are 100% pass criteria, the two score would be, the average score would be 90%, it's an average, but the global score would be 0. I hope it's clear. If it's not, please I go back to that in the question session. So you can see it's really rare to have this difference, so to use difference, but we often have a lot of difference. And we have 3 mentions in Europe, as you know, so not compliant, partially compliant, fully compliant. And to change from a non-compliant to a partially compliant, you should have the score in France of 50% at least. So sometimes with playing with the figures can help you to cheat and to communicate for a good score. What is really problematic to me is we don't have at all the question of the critical error. And maybe you can have a good score and it's not accessible at all. Maybe you can have not such a good score, but a better accessibility for the users. But I guess it's not only in France, this question is really globally. Then we have the problem of the disproportionate burden. And in France, it became really a really big issue. In the European Disability Forum reports, I don't know if you read it, it was published in October 2021. It was a position paper. And they wrote, as we had anticipated, the disproportionate burden clause is being used by some, by France, as a get out of jail free card, a way for some public authorities to avoid taking responsibility for accessibility issues. And that's right. We already have an abuse of derogation, and it's denounced by association. So I just made a screenshot of an article, and you will have the link. And this association, CERTAM from Association Valentin 8, it's an association for people with visual disabilities, try to get the audits of different websites and to check if it was credible, if it was serious. And they had a lot of trouble to get the sources, the audits. So they had sometimes some administration, and that was only big ones, refused to give the audits. So they had to make some procedure because it's the law, so they finally get it. And they have really big surprises. And I can show you some examples. For example, you have in France, it's the same like Lex for the law in Europe. You have the same in France, it's Légifrance. And they made derogation for disproportionate burden on the text of the law and with no explanation. So they made a derogation for the text of the law. So that's really very confusing. And I really don't understand why they did that. And they had this article, and I know they're aware of it. It was in July last year, 2021, and the mention is still there. So that's a question. And the last bad news we had, it's a few days ago. The French government announced a new deadline to 2027. So I quote the CNCPH, without consultation or even prior information. The press kit of the Interministerial Committee on Disability of October 6 and the press release of the Minister of Transformation and Civil Service of November 16, 2022, so it's really recent, indicate that the two 250 procedures, you know, the one of the observatory, most used by the French, will be made 100% accessible by 2027, which contravenes all the texts in force. So that's a surprise. This communication was made in November 2021, so it's the last week. And we see we really have distinction between the civil society, which is ready to work, wants to do things, is aware of what digital accessibility is, the theory with some text of law, and the lack of political will. And I don't see another explanation of that. The last part of my presentation is to share with you some bad news again in France. So we have some activists that try to make things moving in France. And unfortunately, ableism is also in the court. So is it an ableism question? And I think it is. So ableism is discrimination where the norm is based, the ideal you need to is to be able, non-disabled, and everything, every law, every construction, every website is only made for able bodies, able person. And if you're not considered as able, you're just excluded from the society. And that's something we still have in France. We have, you're probably aware of that, but just a quick reminder, we have two different models of disability. Actually, we have more. But years ago, we had what we called the medical model of disability. So the problem was the person. She was not adapted to the society. The society was made for people who are not disabled. And all the social policies were made to fix the person. So to give her some accommodation, of course, but to make her fit this abled society. And with the Convention of the Rights of the Person with Disability of the UN, we shift this model from the medical model to the social model of disability that says we're not disabled, we're less disabled by our diagnosis and our bodies, rather than by the we are more disabled by the environment rather than our bodies and these diagnoses. So the problem is not the person that is perfect as he or she is, but the society that should comply for everyone. But in France today, and that's an accusation that we had from the United Nations, that our definition of disability doesn't fit the social model of disability, not completely. So we still have a charity point of view instead of a justice approach. So we're still in the laws, we still have a problem. And for proof, I have Sophie Cluzel, which was the Secretary of State for Persons with Disability in 2018, who said ableism is a word I do not know. She doesn't want to know. How do you fight something that you don't name? Fortunately, France is not an island far from everything. So we signed the CRPD. And we're part of the EU, so we cannot do what we want. And when the rapporteur of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability came in France in August 2021, He said, so it was Jonas Roskos, he said, I was struck by the high level of discrimination against people with disability in France. And even if maybe you have an image that France is the country of human rights, that's something we really like to say, but as Robert Badinter said, it's more the declaration. We're really good at declaration, but application is really, really bad. And the situation of person with disability in France is really difficult. This problem comes with a failing justice system. So that's really hard. I just want to take two examples. The first one could be a good example. In 2016, you have a man who was blind, Jean-Xavier Welkamp. He worked in MDPH, so that's so funny. That's not funny, it's ironic. But MDPH stands for Maison Départementale des Personnes Handicapées, so it's the administration for persons with disabilities. So he worked there and he used software to work. And one day they just decided to change it, to update it, and the software was not accessible anymore. So this man, Jean-Xavier, wasn't able to work anymore. So he went to work every day, doing nothing. And of course, he had a depression. So you have the burnout, but you also have, I don't know if you know that, but the bore out when you go to your work and you don't have anything to do. And he lost his job because he wasn't able to work anymore. And he sued the administration. The discrimination in this case was recognized, but he spent 4 years he lost his job, he spent 4 years, and what he gets is only 15,000 euros for moral damages and 2,000 euros for legal fees. So this is ridiculous for an administration. And he didn't get his job back. So that's when justice in France works. But we have a special hashtag in France for another case, the trial of shame. So we have a hashtag you can find on Twitter or Mastodon, procès de l'honte. This is still happening now, and that's just incredible. We have some disabled activists from the association Antisocial that decided to protest for accessibility, because we have some new laws that make rights worst, backwards. And they made some protests against Airbus. SNCF is the French agency for railroad, Air France, so planes, and Toulouse Airport. And in March 2021, the Toulouse Correctional Court was noted for its poor accessibility, for its undignified treatment of defendants with disabilities. There were delays preventing them from returning home. So they couldn't go back home because nothing was planned to help them. They didn't make breaks, and some people really need it. They didn't comply with health standards, so it was really crowded in the midst of a pandemic, despite the existence of comorbidities for some of the persons that were in the trial. This trial was from these big companies, Airbus, SNCF, Air France, and Toulouse Airport, against these disabled activists. And during the trial, the judge, we have the report of that, some Association for Human Rights help these activists. And we have some reporters that were there. And the judge herself was so ableist. She didn't want to spend too much time with them. Some people couldn't speak, but they were not allowed to have someone to speak for them. So there were a denial of rights. And they didn't have reasonable accommodation to compensate for their disabilities. The court gave suspended prison sentences to these disabled activists who had blocked a train for 1 hour. And then it was in March 2021. So of course, they went to appeal, an appeal court. But in June 2022, so it's a few months ago, they had a new sentences. So the prison sentences pronounced in the first instance were transformed into fines, but they still found it guilty. So the right to protest, or the interdiction to protest, is more important than the right to accessibility. And the next step is an appeal to the Supreme Court. So, and maybe they will go, and I'm sure, because we have several associations like Fédération des droits de l'homme, Human Rights Association, that help them, but maybe they will need to go to the European Court. So I'm going to make my conclusion. I'm sorry, it's not really funny. The question is, what next? Can we have some hopes? What can we expect from this French situation? I think hope comes from the Europe, because, as I said, France is not the only one, and the European Commission already asked France to give a report and to explain itself. So that's a good thing. And we have a strong social movement in France. France is known for its great theories, as you probably know, but we are also known for the vivacity of its social movements, like strikes or revolution. And I want to give you an example of protests. I went to a march against sexism with an association or a community. I don't know if it's an association, which is called Nous Toutes. It was the first time they organized during the protests, during the march, special accommodation to help all the women and all the person who wanted to go there to go to the march, even if they're tired, if they need some to be quiet space. So we had a reference, some person who really took care of person with disability to help them to contribute to the march. So that's an example of something really new in France. And during the different speeches, everything were with sign language. So that's a good step. But at the same time, they invited for the first time a collectivity, a community, an association actually, of women with disabilities, which is Les Dévalideuses. And the speaker, who is in wheelchair, couldn't go to the place to take to stand up and to give her speech. So nobody can see her. So we have a first step, but we still have a problem to use to make accessibility the new normal. And I think when we think about this situation, that we really need to make a political choice. Which society do we want? It's not a technical problem. We can see in France, we have the technical things, we have the political awareness because we already have a law. So it's really a choice. And this is a crucial question at a time of multifaceted crisis in Europe, military with Ukraine, ecological, energy, economic, and social. And finally, isn't all these a symptom of a political crisis? In every crisis, an opportunity can be born. And I want to be positive in my conclusion, because this opportunity can be of a rethinking of our political and social model, where disability would be the standard meter allowing to evaluate the degree of progress and humanity of a society. And what better place to work on this reflection than the European level together? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harmony. A lot of really interesting, a little bit depressing, but very interesting notes there. So we just have a very short period of time. So I'm thinking you said that the community in France doesn't have a space anymore after Brainet was closing. So to me, of course, an IAAP chapter would be the space for the community. So we really hope that would happen either in France or in French-speaking parts of the world. We're also discussing Canada is bilingual, so there may also happen things in the other side of the pond. But I hope we can get back to discussing a potential French or French-speaking chapter in the future. But I don't think we will solve that in 9 minutes. But
no. Yes, but I think we can speak in January. I think we'll have maybe another space.
Yeah. So, and we did get a question about where there are so few people from France who are members of the IAAP, and of course I cannot really respond to that. But I mean, one reason usually that we have a little bit less representation in a country is either language or a chapter. So we do see a lot of more momentum in countries where we have translations of the exams and so on. And then there's also something called Not Invented Here in France. So I think we need to probably work a little bit harder to convince the French community than we have to in other countries. But so we have a couple of questions about, so as the legal framework is there in principle in France, I guess, could a legal challenge still be successful? And you actually came to a little bit of bad results of legal procedures afterwards, but maybe you want to comment on that, Armony?
I think I'm afraid.
So there is a legal framework in principle, but could the challenge?
I think we have several trials that we're waiting for the answer. So I think association, they're waiting for so many years. So it's 2005, we're in 2022, and now the deadline will be 2027, and maybe, I don't know, it's never-ending process. So now the problem is not the legal aspect, it's really the application of the law. Of course, we can make some progress. Nothing is perfect, but we already have everything we need. We really need now measure for control and real application and real sanction when fines, because some fines, we have fines that are in the law, but nobody is controlling or applying them. So that's just, I don't know.
Let's call it a gap.
Yeah.
So we have another question. So just to the statement that we read from the National Disability Advisory Council, I think, if I understand the French correctly, it's based on a political statement. So I don't really think it's that would deserve a political reply, of course, and I think that is what is happening now. But it's not really. It's kind of talking about setting an objective for accessibility, and that is not really changing kind of the law. It's more of an objective than a legal change. So it's still very disappointing, but it's not a law. It's a right.
No, yes, it's really we're still waiting for a law for the European Accessibility Act. So this one we're waiting for it, but we already have everything we need in the law, in the legal framework. Except
So,
some decrees to make
yes,
it.
but so we also had a comment on that French is certainly not the only country in this situation, and I really agree with that. We have many countries
Yeah, sure.
inside of the EU and outside of the EU where the kind of the policy papers and everything looks really fine, but when you kind of look at the practical level, it's a difference. So it's not like France is the only one having problems, definitely not. So we have another question. What consequences does the current status of the Web Accessibility Directive implementation have? Does the EU force France to change the current status, and how? So what I know of what is happening between the EU or the European Commission and France now is that steps are taken. So that is kind of political lingo for something is going on, but that is not, it's not kind of something that is happening in the open. But of course, when a member state doesn't report in time, that is a breach of the obligations. So then steps are taken, and exactly what is happening and how long that could take or what happens, that I do not know. But there's also a possibility to make the country pay if they really don't do what they're supposed to do. But we're not there yet.
Yeah.
I think it's a discussion.
What can happen, and sometimes that's something happened in France. Sometimes we're really late on the subject, and one day, we don't know why, the politics decides it's really a priority and we're the best. So they put a lot of efforts and it can become something really important, but we still don't have anyone who really wants to do that. But if we have some warning from the European Commission, maybe, and we already had some, maybe it could change. And I really hope it could help, because we need help actually.
And I think that's such an interesting thing. So, and just to comment on the European Accessibility Act, there's still just a little bit more than half of the member states have actually transposed into national legislation. So that is not, also France is not in the best part of the list, but also not alone in not having implemented a national law for the Accessibility Act yet. So I don't think that doesn't have to be a problem. But of course, if you see all the different parts of this, then it looks like a trend. So maybe that is disturbing. But I think really, to me, the lack of the reporting back with the Web Accessibility Directive, that is to me a much bigger problem, because that is something that every other country is doing and rather successfully. And France, one of the big countries, is not doing that. That could kind of maybe lead the others to think, okay, who cares? We don't need to do it.
Yeah, and that's what I try to explain, because in France, it's not a problem to have a law that we don't want to apply. So we have a lot of law. So that's really different from other countries. Sometimes, and I had a discussion with professor in a university in the US, and they said, oh, you don't have a lot of lobbying for new law. We don't need to have a lot of lobbying for that, because nobody is going to apply it anyway. So the problem is we can be really good in implementation. So we're not in the bottom of the list, as you said, but behind that, when you ask, so we have a ministry supposed to do the control, but no one is aware in this ministry that someone is supposed to make a control. So that's just fake. So that's easy to have law if we don't want to apply them.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that now people from across the globe are really looking at the EU because of the monitoring work we do, because the monitoring and the self-declaration and the feedback mechanism, that is something that is not happening anywhere else, and people are looking to the EU for kind of inspiration. So we need to say thank you now, because now we have 1 minute to show the upcoming webinars. Thank you very much for the good discussions, Armony, and all the questions we have had also. And I think we will get back to the French question. Interesting, and maybe we can do a follow-up with you or some of your colleagues in the spring. So I just wanted to very quickly say that we do have a drop-in session in English on the 7th of December, where anyone can join free of charge. You can just ask anything you would like about IAAP, membership benefits, certification, prices, anything, or EU policy and legislation. Of course, you're welcome with any questions. We're usually having myself and Alberto Highlander, who is the coordinator for EU right now answering questions, and also we have a couple of members who are there, so you can ask people who have really been through the certification and the exams and everything. So of course we will tell you that everything is perfect in IAAP, but you will also have the truth from some members from different EU countries. And then we do a really cool thing on the 9th of December. We are doing a drop-in session in Czech, which I cannot speak, but we are having simultaneous translations back and forth because we did a big event, or we supported a Czech event on accessibility earlier this year, and the questions around IAAP and the EU level legislation were so many, so we had no chance of responding to them during the event. So we have a specific drop-in session for the Czech Republic and also some Slovak participants there. So if you know anyone in that part of Europe, please show them to the 9th of December. And then, of course, after Christmas, we will get back with more webinars, newsletters, policy updates, drop-ins, and big events as well as usual. And you're very welcome to join us for that. The first webinar, I'm sorry, I don't have a date yet, but hopefully end of January will be one of my colleagues in the joint working group working with the standards, updating you on the where the EN 301549, all the criteria covered by the Web Accessibility Directive that are not part of WCAG. So really talking about that gap where the EN goes far beyond WCAG. So with that, I would like to thank all our fantastic interpreters and the participants, of course, and don't forget the survey. Thank you, Malcolm, for putting that up. I also should say that we have if you would like to propose a topic or a speaker for the webinars next year, then please don't hesitate to reach out. Also, we do have a more formal call for webinars this whole week. So it ends, the deadline is on the 5th of December if you would like to propose a webinar for the global IAAP as well. And with that, I will thank everyone for today, and especially to Armony for joining us and giving us this very, very good update on France. And I hope that you will still be smiling like you always are and be positive, even if things may look a little bit, maybe not perfect from the French perspective. But as with many other countries, I do hope and think that the EU initiatives are supporting you and making it easier also for policymakers to get things through. I hope the directives will also push things a little bit in the right direction in France. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you either on the drop-in sessions or next year for our next webinars. Bye-bye.
Thank you.